All right. Okay, folks. So, what we're going to discuss tonight is basically the concept of meditation and understanding. But in order to get there, so we have to repeat a certain idea from this week's Torah reading, from this week's parasha, which is called Parashat Dvarim, which is the beginning of the fifth book of the Torah. So, there's an interesting series of verses which talks about the burden that Moshe Rabbeinu felt in leading the Jewish people, and then he sort of complains to God, and he says as follows: how am I going to bear the burden of all the troubles you cause, and basically the burden and your quarrelsomeness, and so on and so forth. Now, there's several ways of understanding that. It doesn't sound like this is Moses speaking, because he has such tremendous love for his people, and but one could understand it that Moses was saying, how alone am I going to be able to bear the troubles which you face, not the troubles which you cause, but the troubles which you face. How am I going to bear that alone? It's impossible for one human being to be able to share in the sorrows of so many people alone. He just doesn't have the time and the ability to be able to listen to everybody's troubles, and so on and so forth. It's not that he's rebuking them. There is such an interpretation. He's rebuking them for being quarrelsome and for being a burden and for being people who bother him in one. There is such an interpretation. But the better interpretation, or the more, let's call it the more interdimensional interpretation, is that he can't share in their pain and their difficulties. And therefore, he says, God says to him, so appoint other people to help you with the task. And this is the instruction that Moses gave them. It says like this: bring people, or bring me people who I will appoint. He's talking to the entire people now. He's talking to at least the heads of the tribes, probably the entire people, and saying, bring me suitable candidates. People who are wise, chachamim, nevoinim, people who have understanding, v'yaduim, and people who have knowledge, da'at. Now, when we're saying over here da'at, we don't mean just simply book knowledge. We mean an intimate understanding of people and the ability to connect to them. That's da'at, l'shivtechem, for each of your tribes. And I will place them as leaders of Asimem Roshechem. I will place them at the heads of the tribes, and they will be able to help deal with people's issues together with Moses, together with Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, so what did he ask for? He asked for people who were wise, people who had understanding, and people who had da'at, or chokhmah and bina and da'at. Chokhmah, bina, da'at being the first of the three imminent sfirot. As everybody knows, Keter is a transcendent sfira. That's sort of a meta sfira, if you want to call it that. Whereas the other sfirot are imminent. Imminent means that they really are, you could explain them as being energy, divine energy, or as as Kabbalah calls it, light, because light is also a form of energy. Light within vessels. That's imminent, the imminent sfirot. So the first of the three imminent sfirot, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, are the qualities that Moses was looking for, that Moshe Rabbeinu was looking for. In any event, it continues, and he says, the people were happy with that, and I said, it's a good thing, and we're going to bring you such people. So, he then goes on to say, V'ekach et roshei shiftechem, anashim chachamim v'yeduim. I placed at the heads of the people who are wise and people who are knowledgeable in the way that we meant before, having da'at, in other words, the ability to connect to others, V'eten otam roshim alechem, I placed them as heads over the people. So our sages point out that there's kind of a disconnect over here. Moses says to bring people who have chokhmah and bina and da'at, and when they bring in people, they only bring in people who possess chokhmah and da'at, but not bina. They don't possess bina. So Rashi, the classic commentator, points out, Aval nevonim lo matzati. Moses says, I didn't find people who were nevonim, people who had understanding. I did not find people who had this understanding. Now, we have to understand what understanding means. We have to try and figure this out and clarify what is meant here by understanding, and that's what has to do with the whole concept of meditation. What is meditation all about? Now, we have some very obvious questions about why it is that he couldn't find people who had bina. Because earlier on in the book of Shmot, in the book of Exodus, in Parashat Kitisa, which is in Exodus 31. Exodus 31, 2. It says like this. No, 3. 31:3. He says that the person that was in charge of building the sanctuary, building the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was Betzalel. Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur, from the tribe of Yehuda. And it says there, "Va'amalei oto ruach Eloki b'chokhma u'v'tvuna u'v'da'at," that Betzalel had chokhmah and tvuna and da'at. He seems to have had these three qualities: chokhmah and tvuna and da'at. He seems to have all three of them. So what happened to Betzalel? And if there was Betzalel and there were others as well that helped him, where did the bina disappear to? Why is there no longer any bina? It seems that this is rather strange. Now the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, who, by the way, whose the commemoration of his passing was yesterday on the 5th of the month of Av. So Rabbi Yitzhak Luria answers, and he says as follows: there's a difference between bina and tevuna. I'm going to write it in the chat over here. If you have a look in the chat, I'll write it in English first. Bina as opposed to tevuna. Or in Hebrew, bina, tevuna. Bina, tevuna, two different things. Yeah, there's bina and there's tevuna. He says tevuna they did have. It says in the verse over there that Betzalel had tevuna, but he didn't have bina. What is the difference? So the difference that Arizal explains is that tevuna, which also means understanding, that's how we usually translate it, but tevuna means understanding of the heart. It means understanding which has an effect on, has ramifications as far as the emotions are concerned. In other words, it's understanding which affects emotions. But pure understanding it didn't have. Well, pure understanding was impossible to find. Moses did not find anyone with bina. He found people with tevuna, but not people with bina. That is the way the Arizal explains it. Now, the classical commentator, again, Rashi, tries to basically explain the difference between someone who has bina and someone who does not have bina. And he gives an analogy, and a very fascinating analogy, and he says as follows: that someone who doesn't have bina is like a person who is like a banker or a money changer. When they bring him money, so he, the money in the old days was basically bits of gold, pieces of gold, and he would weigh it, he would assess it, the quality of the gold. Was it mixed with other metals? How much did it weigh? And so on and so forth. And then he would be able to assess its value. So it's called a chenvani. A chenvani is someone who, is a merchant really, but someone who deals in currencies. Sort of a currency trader, I suppose you could call him. A forex trader. So this currency trader, there's one kind of type of currency trader that he sort of sets up his office, and people come to him and they bring him money for evaluation and for changing, and so on and so forth. So that's one kind of person. There's another kind of chenvani, another kind of trader, forex trader, who, when people don't bring their money to him to evaluate, so he goes out and finds his own. He goes out and finds deals and so on and so forth. And he brokers deals and he makes business and so on and so forth. And that's the difference between, says Rashi, that's the difference between people who have bina and who do not have bina. In other words, someone who has bina is someone who makes business on his own. He doesn't wait for it to come to him. It's more of an active thing rather than just passive. And this is very important in understanding the difference between two types of meditation. Passive meditation, that when an idea comes, you examine it, you think about it, and so on and so forth. But someone who has bina goes out and finds ideas. As it is explained, the word bina is really describes someone who is mevin davar mitoch davar. He understands one thing from another. In other words, he's able to produce a brand new insight from things that he already knows. That's what a person who has bina, that's how he's characterized, or he or she. Actually, when I say she, our sages say that bina yetera nitna beish or yozim beish, that women actually have more bina than men do. Men are more endowed with chokhmah, perhaps da'at, and even chokhmah and da'at for sure, whereas women have less da'at, but they have more bina. And how do we know that? Because it says when Eve was created, vayiven et hatzela. All right, God built, so to speak, Adam's rib into Eve. He cloned Adam's rib to become Eve. So, however, when we want to understand that now, I'm not going to go into it, but the point is that the word that's used there is vayiven. Vayiven, say our sages, means that he made a woman with more bina. The woman has more bina, more intuitive understanding, more understanding which is in itself productive, which brings understanding from within previously learned things. And that exactly is what meditation is all about. Meditation isn't simply repeating what it is that you already know. That might be the beginning of meditation. Although that's not even the beginning of meditation, that's already somewhere along the road, and I'll start at the beginning shortly. But to be able to come to new understandings, to new insights, which were apparently not, they certainly weren't explicit in the previous knowledge, and perhaps were even less than implicit, and yet new inspirational ideas are generated from information which is already from things which are already known and understood. New understanding comes, and that's what meditation is all about. Now, let me begin really at the beginning. Prior to meditation, and there are some groups that focus almost exclusively on this, Breslau, for instance, but the way we understand it is that this is only a preliminary to meditation. One of the aspects of, or the preliminary step in meditation is what is called hitbodedut. Hitbodedut means inner isolation. Isolating oneself from the world around you in order to turn inwards and upwards. So this concept of isolation, inner isolation, is called, in Hebrew, it's called hitbodedut. Now, does that mean that a person has to go out into the forest or, on mountaintops or into a cave or whatever to be alone? Well, that certainly does help to a certain extent. And we know that the Arizal, as a young man, spent many, many, many days alone. In fact, the entire week he spent alone. So did the Baal Shem Tov. Spent the entire week alone. He only came home for a Sabbath, for Shabbat. And the rest of the time they spent in isolation, meditating essentially. And they would only come home to their families like once a week. In the case of the Arizal, this went on for many years. In the case of the Baal Shem Tov, it also went on for like 5 years. And that is part of the way in which they reached tremendously lofty levels. But hitbodedut doesn't mean striking out alone and becoming sort of a hermit, even during the week, or even for me, maybe a couple of days at a time. It doesn't necessarily mean that. Yes, it can help in the beginning to teach one how to sort of isolate oneself, but it is not an absolutely necessary step. One can be isolated within a room full of people. And in fact, that's much more effective and much more difficult to learn, really, how to isolate oneself when one is in a crowd. Now, when we say isolate oneself, I'm not talking about not communicating with people. That's not what isolation means. Isolation means turning inwards, focusing inwards and upwards in what's going on in one's own soul. Usually, most of the day, we are focused outwards. And we have to be, in order to be able to survive, to be able to live like normal human beings, we have to be focused outwards, at least to a great extent. Focusing outward means focusing through your senses on the world around us. So the process of hitbodedut is a process of, to a certain extent, shutting off the senses and focusing inwards so we can see what's going on internally rather than we can see what's going on externally. This in itself is an exercise which many people find very difficult because we're so used to stimulation of the senses, sensual stimulation, all day long, that it's very, very hard to turn inwards. Now that may explain, just by the way, this may explain like the sudden penchant that people have for like virtual reality. What's wrong with normal reality? Virtual reality, even though it doesn't do what it should do, it doesn't turn a person within completely, but it certainly shuts him off from the world for a certain amount of time. In an unhealthy way, in my opinion, but nevertheless, that's what the effect is, and that's why virtual reality seems to be so popular so suddenly, because people are sort of far too much involved in the outside world and never turn inwards. Okay, so the first step, therefore, of meditation is hitbodedut, inner isolation, the ability to shut yourself off from what's going on around you, shut yourself off from the world, and focus inwardly. And that doesn't mean that one doesn't hear or see what's going on, but that's not the point of focus. Like when a person is kind of daydreaming, when you daydream, and it often happens. I can tell you for myself, when I'm driving on long trips or whatever it is, things are going on in your mind, and you're not really noticing the road. You're not noticing where you're going so much. Yes, if there's a sudden, unexpected movement, you snap out of it immediately and focus on what's going on. But your thoughts are elsewhere. Says the Baal Shem Tov, "B'makom shemachshavto shel Adam, sham hu nimtza." Where your thoughts are, that's where you are to be found. Where your thoughts are, that's where you are to be found. Now, it doesn't mean physically, obviously, but it means if your attention is on internal processes and thinking things through inside, you're not focusing that much on the outside. And that's the first step, really, in hitbodedut, in meditation, is to focus inwards. And that's, to a certain extent, dulls or even shuts off the senses in deep meditation. But that is only the first step. That's only the first step. The next step in meditation is really emotional isolation, emotional hitbodedut. In other words, isolating a certain emotion, and you can choose that emotion, whether it's the emotion of love, or the emotion of awe, or the emotion of compassion, whatever it might happen to be, and focusing on situations that brought forth that emotion so that we can feel it again, to feel emotion of joy, and so on and so forth. That would be now a more a step in the direction of actual meditation, because it's starting to arouse emotions as a first step. And then the third step in meditation would really be focusing on ideas which generate the ideas which generate those emotions, the ideas which generate those emotions and affect the emotions and arouse the emotions and make a person feel filled up with, let's say, compassion, or with love, or with awe, or whatever it may happen to be. So those ideas that bring about that, or the images that we try and conjure up in our minds, or the ideas that we think about to engender, to generate those emotions, those ideas are ideas which are called, they're not yet called bina, but they are called kavuna. In other words, intellectual ideas, intellectual concepts, but which are directed towards emotional arousal. So just to give by way of an easy example to contemplate, let's say you once went to a play, or you watched a movie that has very tear-jerking scenes in it, tear-jerkers. So if you contemplate that scene, that tear-jerking scene, which made you want, when you were actually watching the movie for the first time, made you want to cry, so that would once again arouse that particular emotion, the emotion of feeling so sorry for a person, compassion, whatever it is, whatever exactly the tears were. And then exploring that emotion and so on and so forth, and its connection to the idea, what is it about the idea that brings forth this emotion, and so on and so forth. That would be one possibility. Then the ideas of love and ideas of awe and so on and so forth. These are all intellectual ideas, concepts, but concepts that have emotional impacts on a person. But getting beyond that is where hitbonenut, where meditation, the concept of meditation really begins. What it is an intellectual, a very deep and detailed, and it's called in Hebrew, it's called iyun. Iyun means depth research, really, as a research into the depths of an idea. Exploring an idea, mentally exploring a concept, but in such a way that a person becomes completely absorbed in it. Completely absorbed in it. Now, this is kind of a difficult thing to do. It's you have to have a lot of concepts to be able to, quite a conceptual framework in order to be able to do this. But what it is possible to do is to study a paragraph, let's say a paragraph from the Zohar, or a paragraph from the Arizal, or a paragraph from Hasidic teachings, and those are available. Let's say a paragraph from Tanya, or whatever, and contemplate it. Not just contemplate the words, obviously, but what is the idea behind the words? Like, what is the author trying to get me to think? What's the gateway that he's opening for me? What's the gate that he's opening? And when one starts to explore that idea, so one goes, as long as you don't restrict yourself, you go, so to speak, as is explained in certain Kabbalistic texts. When you open a door, you see many more doors before you. You open one door and go through it in order to try and think it through, and then it seems to you that there are many, many other doors that you could go through, and you start exploring. You go through another door and then another door and so on and so forth. In other words, you start exploring the ramifications of those ideas in your own consciousness to the extent that a person gets completely and absolutely absorbed, so absorbed in the idea that he sort of loses sense of himself, loses sense of time, and so on and so forth. There's a story which the Rebbe Rayatz was Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who's the father-in-law of my Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rabbi Schneerson. His father-in-law, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, tells a story about his father, about someone who was called the Rebbe Rashab, Rabbi Shalom Dovber. And he said that once his father, he came into the room and his father was sitting there, sitting in the room, and he had a book open in front of him, and his eyes were open, and he wasn't there. He wasn't present. He wasn't in the room. He was there, physically he was there, but his mind was somewhere else. Again, where a person's mind is, where his thoughts are, that's where he is. He or she, obviously. So he sat quietly for a while, watching his father and seeing what was, and he saw that his father did not have any sense of what was going on around him. He didn't have there was no recognition that his son had walked into the room. There was no recognition that his son was sitting there sort of waiting to talk to him. He was completely absorbed in thinking something through. Now, the Rabbi Rayatz at this time was young. He was a fairly young man, and he got kind of nervous. Like, what's going on over here? His father seems to be completely in another world, and he got kind of nervous. So he started like making noises and like jiggling chairs and moving around and moving objects around in the room to try and pull his father out of this what seemed like a trance. He was worried because he saw that there was absolutely no response to anything. But nothing. Some hours later, his father sort of woke up. Not that he was asleep, he wasn't. His eyes were open the whole time. So sometime later, his father sort of came back to the conscious world. And his son, Rebbe Rayatz, reported that when his father sort of came conscious, he didn't know where he was at first. Right? He didn't have a sense of where he was and what he was doing. He didn't have a sense of what time of the day it was. So he sort of asked in a very sort of indirect way, he tried to find out what the time was. He didn't want to ask his son, like, what's the time? Showing that he was completely in a different world. So he asked him some other kind of question that, did mother eat dinner yet, or whatever, something like that, because he didn't know what time of the day it was. In any event, the point of the story that I'm saying over here, the point of the story is that there's a certain level of absorption in something that one can become like fully absorbed in it, trying to understand the concept and all of its ramifications, all of its connections, and all of its, like how it unfolds upwards, so to speak. In other words, any concept that a person thinks about has preceding ideas which feed into that concept. Like, what were the preceding ideas? What gave rise to this idea, to this concept? What's behind it? Where would it lead to if I follow it back to its original thought, right? And where would those lead to, and so on and so forth. And you can go very deeply into what would be called hitbonanut. Hitbonanut is, again, meditation of these ideas, but it is, at least in the Chabad Hasidic community, it is a process of thought and thinking deeply. There are other types of meditation where one concentrates on, letters or words, or one concentrates on lights or on structures or on sounds, certain sounds. But the most common, these days anyway, the most common type of meditation is this sort of conceptual meditation, the meditation of Bina. Now, to get back to our texts, Moses didn't find people who could be called Bina. Also, Andrea asks, how's this method not just my own imagination? Does that not really matter? Well, it does matter. It does matter. So you have to start off with a conceptual basis. And that's sort of, in other words, one has to spend some time learning. Now, basically, let's explain it as follows. Trying to understand a concept, learning a concept and understanding something about it or whatever it is, that would be meditation during study. But once you put the book aside and you're not focusing on the words anymore or the idea per se, but you're trying to get the feeling of those words, like what's the impact of those words? That's first we try and understand it, then what's the impact of those words on me? What's the impact of that idea upon me? And then a deeper level, what are the antecedents to that idea? What led to that idea? Where does it come from? What is the what's behind it? And the second stage that I just mentioned is attempting to feel the energy of to assess and to feel the energy, in other words, the impact on me, and what energy impacts me when I'm learning this particular thing. How do I feel when I learn it? What is the emotional impact? That's still Tabuna. Then we try to get beyond that. What is the godliness in this concept? Or if you want to put it this way, how is God's thought operating within this concept? That would be Bina. And that leads from one thing to another thing to another thing to another thing, etc., etc. It's all connected. One starts to see all kinds of connections. So that really is Bina. Now, why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you all of this because somebody asked me a question this week about styles of meditation, about process of meditation, and so on and so forth. So I started doing I wrote a book on it once, booklet, which initially I used to give out for free. It was downloadable from the website. Probably many of you have it. So I wrote a book about the subject, a booklet about the subject, but I decided to go into a more structured examination of the ideas according to the writings of one particular author. That author whose son was worried that he'd sort of floated away completely. In other words, the Rebbe Rashab. And I've been spending basically the whole week delving into this idea and trying to understand exactly what the steps are. Now, I'm at the beginning of figuring it out. I haven't figured it out yet. I don't know if I will figure it out completely. It's very, very deep ideas. They're very deep ideas here. But I just wanted to share with you some of the things that I've been kind of doing this week, and hoping that it will stimulate some interest, and then perhaps we can go into a deeper understanding of meditation. In fact, I was thinking about, although this is at least some weeks away, if not longer, I'm thinking about an actual course in meditation. In other words, a guided course, or a course in guided meditation, step 1, step 2, step 3, what are you going to do, etc. But with exact, processes and so on and so forth, until one can get to the point at which things kind of open up and you don't need all that much guidance anymore. So I'm thinking of doing such a course. I don't even know if it's really possible. I'm working on it. I'm trying to figure it out. But if anyone is interested, so drop me a line and we could perhaps talk a little bit more about it. Okay, folks.